Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Brenda Tyndall. I am the Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and an appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, I am delighted to welcome you to today's conversation about the making of the exhibition In Search of Thoreau's Flowers, which opened at the Harvard Museum of Natural History earlier this year in April. We are delighted to have the artists and scientists who collaborated in developing the show with us tonight. Together, they will discuss the project, focusing on how the fusion of art and science can help us all reach a meaningful understanding of the relationship between biodiversity, climate change, and our own actions. After the program, we will invite you to join us in the galleries of the museum. At that time, you can explore the exhibition, enjoy some refreshments, and speak with our panelists and others in attendance about the creative and scientific dimensions of In Search of Thoreau's Flowers. First, we will invite Leah Sobsey to the stage to provide an overview of In Search of Thoreau's Flowers. She is the Associate Professor of Photography at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. We will then welcome to the mic Elena Kramer, Bussey Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and Interim Director of the Harvard University Herbaria, who will introduce the speakers and moderate today's program. Thank you so much for being here with us, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brenda, for welcoming us this evening, and Diana for organizing. We're thrilled to be here to have a conversation that revolves around art, science, Thoreau, and plants. Like Brenda said, I'm Leah Sobsey, one of the two artists that created the work for the Thoreau exhibition. Robin Vuchnik, the other artist, couldn't be in person here this evening, but she's prepared a few remarks about her process and her video contribution, which we'll hear partway through the panel talk tonight. So in the meantime, before we launch into our panel discussion, I want to give those of you who haven't seen the exhibition some context and some imagery. Our interdisciplinary team behind In Search of Thoreau's Flowers emerged from the strong belief that art and science can and should be in conversation to explore difficult issues. So we came together to create this multimedia exhibition using the digitized collection of Thoreau's pressed plant specimens preserved at the Harvard Herbarium. And we're excited to talk about it. One of his pressed plants. Thoreau's collection is a botanical time machine that exists in combination with his extensive notes about about where and when his specimens were collected. Our installation draws from these to provide insight into environmental change, featuring original specimens, cyanotypes, sorry, I got ahead of myself, cyanotypes, data visualization, soundscapes, and projected augmented reality. So this is what the science looks like, an Excel spreadsheet. And I can tell you, as an artist, that my brain sort of goes numb when I look at this. So my job is to translate this into some visual information, and perhaps one that can simultaneously convey loss and beauty and empathy at the same time. As a photographer, I knew I wanted to include Anna Atkins into the conversation. Atkins was an English botanist and photographer, and is often considered the first female photographer and the first person to publish a book illustrated with photographic images. This seminal book changed the way that we understood science. Until then, books were illustrated. Atkins used the photogram technique, which places the plant directly onto sensitized paper, exposing it to UV light, and creating a beautiful Prussian blue tone, which is what you see here. She also collected and pressed specimens, so this is one of her sheets, and was a distant cousin to Jane Austen. My portion of the artwork consisted of the cyanotype wallpaper, working with Robin's conceptual framework for the DataViz piece, which I'll show in a moment. All 648 specimens in Thoreau's collection are represented in the wallpaper. The dark blue are in severe decline, and the light blue are surviving or thriving, in some cases adapting to climate change. Along with the cyanotype wallpaper, created what I'm calling portraits. These are 4 oval cyanotype images, and they're printed directly onto glass, invoking the history of photography. I've used Thoreau's journals as an underlying text in the images. They are then backed in 23-karat gold, revering them, as well as creating a mirror-like surface and another layer of reflection. I have a short, very short video here for you about the process. So I've taken these digitized images of Thoreau's and made black and white negatives and hand-coated the cyanotype glass. These are pretty large sheets, 26 by 38 inches, and exposing them to UV light. And what happens is, for me, never gets old in the darkroom, is this magic, this alchemy that happens. So it's a latent image, and when you pour water and peroxide, in this case, you get this beautiful blue tone. And now moving on to Robin. So new media artist Robin Vucinic developed the creative and conceptual framework for a data visualization that is seen throughout the exhibit. With Emily's guidance on potential data stories, she developed a strategy to visualize and organize the entire collection into one view. And she's got a little video here. So using color coding to differentiate those species that are in decline or locally extinct due to climate change. That accounts for over half of the herbarium, and the visualization of evidence became a key takeaway for the exhibit. Robin also developed the immersive experience by animating and projecting larger-than-life specimens and visualizations featuring flowering plants that are in severe decline due to climate change. These are projected onto the theater walls and floor and offer visitors a view of the loss of a diverse and colorful range of species. Here's another little video. And we'll talk more about this in the panel, but one of the things that we have found is that kids really gravitate towards this. I can't see you with my reading glasses. Now I can see you. Watching people try to interact with this piece of Robin's has been one of the wonderful things to see. So that's my part of the presentation, and I'll turn it over to Elena, and if everyone wants to come up.
All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. So I'll start with my very good friend, Charles Davis, who is Professor of Organism and Evolution Biology and also the curator of vascular plants at the Harvard University Herbaria. This is Emily Meineke. Emily is an assistant professor at University of California, Davis, and a collaborator of Charles. This is Marcia Gordon, who's a professor at North Carolina State University. And you already heard a little bit about Leah Subsi, but I'm going to give you all of her attributes. So she is an artist, a curator, an associate professor of photography, and director of the Gateward Gallery at the University of North Carolina. So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you all as well for joining us today. So we have a lot of different things to talk about. I'm going to start sort of with Emily, sort of about the origin story of this project. So this is this very diverse team, and I know you were kind of like a nucleation point for bringing it together. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how this very diverse group of people came together.
Yeah, so I did my PhD work at North Carolina State University, and I'm a North Carolina native, and so I'm really passionate about the South and about the artists and the people, creatives who come from there. And I also did my work in entomology, which meant I was outdoors a lot, collecting insects. And for my postdoc work, I wanted to understand the history of insect interactions with plants, and there weren't a lot of data streams for doing that with. And then I found herbarium specimens, and I found these really old specimens that had insect bite marks on them, and I got really excited about that as a data stream for understanding, for instance, effects of climate change. So I wrote a grant to do that. I came here to start working with Chuck at the Harvard University Herbaria, and I spent a lot of time with the herbarium specimens themselves and just like had so much fun. I mean, I would come in on Saturday mornings, not because I felt like I had to, but because I loved that I could interact with these specimens that were hundreds of years old. And I was like, why aren't people doing art with these? And then I remembered my friend Leah, who had been doing art with specimens for a really long time. And so Leah and I met through a supper club that my husband started many years ago. And so how long have we known each other? I mean, 15 years? So I talked to Leah about this when I went home to visit, and then I talked to Marcia about it. We're sort of newer friends, but still have known each other for probably 7 or 8 years. And Marcia was like, we should do a project with herbarium specimens. And I was like, I don't know exactly what it would be, but we had all of these informal conversations. And then I talked to Chuck about it, and he was like, we've been thinking about doing something with Thoreau's herbarium for a really long time in terms of a museum exhibit. And so it seemed like there was a space for it. And then the digitization of Thoreau's specimens happened because Chuck initiated those specimens being available to the public. They're available on Flickr, and so you can actually like surf through them yourself. And once that happened, then Marcia and Leah and I were like, okay, it's time to do something about this. And Marcia brought Robin into the conversation as a new media artist. As you can see, she is incredible, projects her work on buildings. I mean, just does the coolest work on sand dunes, for instance. And so we got together as a team, and we just sort of like, not floundered, but we passed ideas around for a long time. We really didn't come up with specific ideas for a while. And then we started gradually moving toward this idea of doing an art science fusion exhibit. And the idea that compelled us the most was some science that Charlie Willis and Chuck had worked on together, looking at the plant phylogenetic tree, so the evolutionary history of plants, and how that informs plant responses to climate change. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit, because I think you'll talk about it better than me.
It's really great to hear this story. I love this. So the science that's sort of featured prominently in the exhibit, I was thinking about this today. It goes back like 16 years now. Time just moves. But in a nutshell, the idea is that we were able to sort of connect change in abundance and the ability or inability to respond to climate through flowering times, which are just, it's a really important key climate response trait for plants. And the linking connection to this was this evolutionary tree, a phylogeny. So really taking a macroevolutionary perspective, and a phylogeny is really important to Darwin. It was the lone figure on the Origin of Species, so it's just a really important metaphor for thinking about descent with modification, but it never previously been used in this kind of ecological context with these sorts of data. And once you sort of start to look at it through this lens, you see kind of in fine scale pattern the kind of changes that are taking shape, which is that climate change is not happening in this random or uniform way. It's actually targeting particular groups of related species. And it's those species that are not especially temperature sensitive that are most in decline. So having this kind of macroevolutionary perspective and framework really helped to bring a lot of these connections into shape. And one of the things that, and indeed the data themselves were initiated by Henry David Thoreau. So it connected kind of climate change response in a new way here in New England that had a broad and important impact. The nature of these kind of data, gathering data across the seasons and over years, is sort of the gold standard for documenting how plants are responding to climate. And the difficult challenge with these kind of data is that they're few and far between. And so they sample generally a small number of often woody tree species. They sample only over a period of about 25 years. And they're mostly represented from Western Europe and from the US. So here you have a trait that's really important for thinking about how organisms and plants in particular are responding to climate, and yet we really don't understand this trait for the vast majority of plants that inhabit the planet. And so how do you grow these data? And you can't travel back in time, or at least not in the way we think about traveling back in time. But herbaria capture this record in incredible detail. And so the idea is that we can sort of bridge this gap, this impasse of expanding our knowledge of climate change response in plants across space, time, and species by looking at records in our natural history museums and in herbaria. And there are 400 million herbarium specimens around the world in about 3,000 different herbaria, and that's great if you can travel to all of them. And that's not possible for the vast majority of the world, and scientists in particular. And so what is kind of reducing the barrier of access is making these specimens available online through digitization. So it's creating images, it's transcribing the data, and it's making them available online to the world. And it's facilitating exactly the kind of sort of cross-disciplinary work that we're talking about here today. So you can do this kind of science at a scale and a scope that just wasn't possible before, and there's new disciplines of scholarship that are moving in to utilize these resources. And so, I'm really excited in so many ways about the science, and I'm also excited about the fact that they use herbaria in this novel way to really highlight key aspects of how nature is changing.
Maybe you guys want to chime in a little bit about how you developed the installation from, you get all these digitized images. So where did you guys go from there?
Yeah, well, actually, if you don't mind, I want to just do one more loop back to the origin story, because we started this project in 2017, so it took about 5 years from our initial conversations to realization. And when I was thinking about coming here to talk about this, I was thinking, what was happening in 2017? And I remember feeling a sense of despondency for a lot of reasons that had to do with the political environment, that had to do with the bad news about climate change that seemed to be ongoing and unfurling. Tropical storm Harvey happened in the fall that flooded Houston. There were chemical fires. I mean, I remember feeling this sense of kind of hopelessness and powerlessness. And when we started meeting to talk about collaborating on this project, I'm a film historian, so I have done some work in educational film that has to do with climate change, particularly, or had to do with environmental issues from the 1960s and 1970s, and I've done some gallery installation work. But But this is kind of going out of my lane to work on a project like this, but I needed to do something that felt like it was addressing this issue in a concrete way, and also in a way that embraced the beautiful aspects of the natural world. And so, so those conversations, which largely happened kind of around my dining room table, we would meet kind of on a monthly basis and just kick around ideas, and it was a very free-flowing period of time trying to imagine how we could envision this. And one of our early conceptualizations was when you go up to see the exhibition and you saw images of this in the slideshow, there's the kind of floor projection that's like a body of water. I don't know if you all remember this, but our first idea for that was we're going to pour milk into a big basin. And once we started talking to Harvard, we're like, do you think they'll care if we have milk in a big basin? We'll probably have to refresh it. We were so naive about what we could do because we wanted to have a kind of liquid experience. So Robin had to figure out how to simulate it. But I remember doing that for the first time. We poured milk in a basin, and we had the projector up there trying to figure out how to. So we went through a lot of trial and error during that period of 2017 to this past year.
Can you imagine those children would be, instead of playing on the floor, they'd be in a milk fountain?
I can't imagine it.
I don't think Brenda would have let us get that far. I think
No.
Brenda would have said like, maybe not, maybe not.
No.
That's okay. Yeah. So, but you guys were able to sort of like draw inspiration. But I love the connection to the cyanotype and Atkins. I think that's really fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think all along that was at the root of it in terms of how do we bring it to life and what are some components we know we want to include. That, we thought about, I think in the very beginning, these sort of iterations, like we said, the milk. I wanted to do this giant sort of fabric meditation tent, like those kinds of things that just won't operate well in a science museum where I'm used to operating in an art museum. So thinking like the consideration, those kinds of considerations, even the wallpaper, versus original cyanotypes on the wall. So having to sort of think about who moves through the space and how. And like I said, the kids are constantly, moving through, which is great, and sort of thinking about how do we make those decisions. But yeah, I mean, the cyanotype for me, I mean, in some ways, my work is rooted in sort of 19th century process and this kind of hybrid thinking about analog and digital and how do they inform the past in the same way that I think about, those specimens, that what can we learn from the history, both from these, specimens from Thoreau, but also just in terms of my own background in photography and sort of always making reference to that doesn't get lost in the process. So it felt important to me as a nod to, like I said, Anna Atkins, who, I think, like many women of that time period, got left out of the conversation, both in art and science. And so that felt important when we were, meeting together as women. Sorry, Chuck, you weren't in the room with us. But, that felt really important to us to include, these women who had been sort of lost in the conversation. So, cyanotype was always at the heart of it. And you can see that,
Right. Would this be a good time to show Robin's video while we're talking about sort of this transition? So I know in my own teaching, we make this connection between science and art, and having our students transform the science that we've taught them into representative and sort of art forms is a really great way also to communicate that information. But yeah, I think Robin's going to talk some more about how you approach this.
I will play her video. It's about a 7-minute video.
Hi, I'm Robin Vushnik, and I'm a new media designer, and I worked mainly on the digital media side of the exhibit. And I want to speak for a moment on how the art and the science in this exhibit interact with one another, and how some of that was conceptualized. So conceptually, a big picture goal for all of the artwork was to use art to facilitate reflection and conversation and hopefully an emotional response to the science that's being presented and to what it tells us about climate change and diminishing biodiversity. I became interested in pursuing some actual data visualization strategies with the herbarium images. And I wanted to do that in a way that would be creative and hopefully also beautiful, but also coherent and legitimately organized based on some real numbers that come from real data. So in addition to artwork of the plants that we plan to have sit alongside the scientific information to point to beauty and loss and do that in an interpretive way, I felt really compelled for us to develop some artwork that would convey scientific data through the art itself in a more direct way, which for me meant identifying potential ways to organize a view of the entire image collection, again, by the numbers somehow. So I needed to work with Emily's guidance to get a more nuanced view of what was happening in these spreadsheets that she was sharing, and to learn what potential data stories were present there. And at some point during that work or exploration, Emily emailed me a scholarly article that was authored by Charles and several of his collaborators. And then I had this sort of aha, like, there it is moment when I read a statement that among the plants that Thoreau collected, 27% of them are now locally extinct to the area around Walden Pond, and 36% are in decline to the degree that that they're kind of tumbling towards the same fate. And I found that really shocking and devastating. And I thought if I could use these images to show, just show that, that's kind of a way of providing visual evidence of climate change, and which is, it's hard to put forward visual evidence of climate change in a way that really strikes people because it feels so slow moving and incremental. But here we have this collection of images that we can use that kind of allows us to collapse the timeline between then and now. And when you look at that collection with that new layer of data layered over it, it's really compelling. And I was convinced that showing the whole collection in one view would be visually just very stunning anyway because of the enormity of the collection and the beauty and the diversity of the plants that are there. And it would also give me the ability to kind of treat it like a pie chart in a way, like a glorified pie chart, by using color coding to show which sheets contain the plants that are in decline. And do it in a way, and since it's like simple percentages, do it in a way that a kid or a scientist could understand, at a glance. And so I shared a prototype of that graphic, that grid with our team, along with some soundscapes and floor animations. And that's how that visual became an important part of, the data stories that are told in the exhibit. And I think anytime you drop a person into a highly sensory experience, such as an immersive exhibit where you're surrounded by light and sound and color and imagery in cases of objects, they're going to be at least for a moment captivated, so momentarily captivated by their own curiosity about what it's all about and what's going on around them, so that you have this chance to communicate something really powerful because of that, and because that interactivity is baked into an immersive exhibit, meaning interacting with your environment, sharing that space with others. There's a performative quality to it when you watch people interacting in an immersive kind of experience that can open up conversation and a deeper engagement with whatever material is being put forward. So I think that the science moves through the artwork in this exhibit kind of in provocational ways, because we're asking the viewers to see the fact of the science, literally a big picture of some visual evidence, and then also provocation to feel and reflect, literally and figuratively, the reflective portraits, the pond, the projected pond. All of these images are, meant to point towards a kind of self-reflection. And I think a last note on color, the divergent use of color in the there's some retouched flowering plants and some animations, and it's a little bit divergent from what's going on in the rest of the exhibit. And that for me was a way just to breathe a little sign of life back into the specimens without completely corrupting what a plant specimen looks like. And I wanted viewers to understand that these species around Walden, they were not brown, homogeneous, dried weeds. They were of diverse variety. They were flowering and colorful, and not as homogeneous as they look as specimens pressed on paper, because I think it can be hard to imagine them as they were in that landscape, and how much, and then consider how much that landscape must have changed with that color being removed. And I hoped it would help people connect to the parts of the plant's story as this unique, living, thriving thing, like that part of the story, the part of the plant story where it exists, and it's alive and thriving, while the blue that informs all the artwork as a signifier of loss in our exhibit, does its work. And the cyanotype aesthetic that arcs over, all of the work is the sensibility that Leah Sobsey brings to the look of the entire exhibit through her practice. So she'll have lots of insights on that to share.
I'm really interested in this idea of reanimation, because in many ways the research is reanimating, right, this old plant information that has been sitting pressed and in storage for all of these years. And then, of course, what Robin is doing in her part of the installation is another iteration of reanimation, right? Like a more literal visual one. But it's all really about going into the archives and thinking about this old material and the data that can be extrapolated from it, and recontextualizing it and bringing it to life in a space that's very accessible, right? I mean, that's one of the great things about this particular museum, is that there's so many people that come through it of all ages. So
that totally makes sense. So, I mean, we can sort of expand on this idea of collaboration and multidisciplinarity, like where you found the touch points to make those connections. And I don't know if each of you might want to comment on how you.
Yeah, I think in the beginning we just made a lot of space for learning about one another and discussion, because in this multidisciplinary team, I feel like there's a sense of trust that needs to be built where everyone's listening to everyone else. And ultimately, I think we needed for me to share what the science was and for Chuck and I to discuss things, because a lot of the development of some of these ideas actually happened at Marcia's kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Chuck wasn't, but we were discussing the science. And so I was the sort of ambassador for the scientific ideas. And so I would relay what the science was, and then Robin and Leah would respond at our next meeting with some ideas about how the science might be incorporated. But it now that I look back on it, I see that, but it wasn't that codified in the moment. It was more like we were a bunch of friends who were getting together to discuss something that we were very interested in. Mm-hmm. And we hoped it could come to Harvard, but that wasn't for sure at that moment. And so, I think in terms of our teamwork, one of the things that I've noticed is that if someone hasn't spoken in a while, we turn to that person and we say, what are you thinking? So there needed to be some trust that was built in the space made for every team member. Those are the things that I can sort of point out about our teamwork. And we all have profound respect for one another too, which helped with our communication.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we were thinking about is, how do we translate this information, right, obviously to the visual, but also, in this room, I imagine we all care about climate change and thinking about these plants and loss. But I think what Marcia was saying, this sort of need to act. I mean, as an artist making work, I just feel just this, I don't know, this it just feels so pressing. I don't feel like I have a choice, really. And just on a personal level, I think when I had kids, it just changed everything. And I thought, what is this legacy that we're leaving? And as an artist, how do I talk about that? I mean, I don't know how to talk about the science. My dad's a scientist, but so this was a way to sort of invite more people into the conversation. And I also just think, it's always about loss, and it's always about the tragedy. And so we were wanting to offer this different perspective about, on one hand, that loss and beauty can live together, and inviting people into that. And so, and like Robin said, that it's not all doom and gloom. There is some life still there. So I think that's part of what was at the, really at the heart of the conversation, was always like this kind of balancing act of that. And really the sense of empathy. I mean, I think, how do we get people to care? And I think that really felt critical. And I mean, again, just bringing it back to the art in terms of, for me, that's a way to invite people into a conversation. That it's not like, I remember you saying, Emily, really early on, like if I have to see one more article about climate change, right? It's like we shut down. And so what are other ways we can think about opening up the conversation and having it be hopefully an invitation?
Right. You're creating a new vocabulary that's more welcoming to the public, yeah.
And obviously Thoreau plays a huge part of this. When we started collaborating on this project, I was like, well, I haven't read Walden since college, so I need to reread Walden, which I did. And when I was thinking about tonight, I thought, the story that stuck out to me most in that rereading was, I don't know if you remember the story about the wood table and the bug, but to refresh your memory, if it's been a while. Thoreau tells a story about a 60-year-old table made of apple wood, and he says that it was made in Connecticut, then moved to Massachusetts, and 60 years after it was made, he says the guy who has the table starts hearing this noise. I'm like, what is that noise? What is that noise? Like, and then all of a sudden a bug comes out of the table. So now what Thoreau says, and I just wrote these couple sentences down because I wanted to read this for a purpose. Who does not feel his faith in a resurrection and immortality strengthened by hearing of this? Who knows what beautiful and winged life, whose egg has been buried for ages under many concentric layers of woodenness in the dead, dry life of society, deposited at first in the alburnum of the green and living tree, which has been gradually converted into the semblance of its well-seasoned tomb, heard perchance gnawing out now for years by the astonished family of man as they sat round the festive board, may unexpectedly come forth from amidst society's most trivial and hand-sewed furniture to enjoy its perfect summer life at last. Now, is this an apocryphal story? I don't know, scientists tell me. I think there's probably other scenarios how, this bug crawled out of the wood. But it doesn't matter in some ways, right? Because
the bug represents?
for Thoreau, Thoreau was, was not a scientist. I call him a naturalist, right? He was a poet. He was an observer. He was a philosopher. And to me, that's the beauty of returning to that text and thinking about, well, okay, how does that interact with all of this other information? He is the generator of this entire project. And we need the poets, we need the artists, we need to have those beautiful reflections. That passage I just read you, I find so moving. In part because he's seeing it through a totally different lens than you would if you observe that as a scientist, right? So that to me was part also of this energy of bringing together different perspectives to talk about this particular subject.
Yeah. Well, and thinking about bringing in the public, I don't know, Chuck, if you want to expand on the citizen science aspect of this. You've been talking about this digitization work and how we're putting all of these images of all these specimens online, but we also don't have enough graduate students to go through and look at them all. So yeah, maybe you could talk about that a little.
Yeah, I in everything I do, I try to go big or go home.
It's true. Yes, I know you well, yes.
So once we very quickly realized that yes, this was fun and interesting and worthwhile, but the data were limited. How do you scale research to the level of continents and huge numbers of species? And so, the digitization of these collections helps as a starting point, but then one has to score them. You have to gather the data from the specimens. And when we started this initiative, it was prior to widespread digitization. I had an undergrad that I worked with closely, and she traveled across New England to gather data from collections. But this wasn't feasible for looking across the entirety of the eastern United States or more broadly. And so, you know, and this is, I think, just indicative of the way this biodiversity science is moving, and that is to engage with computer scientists and to think about tools that can be developed to harvest these data. And so we've started with crowdsourcing. We create small experiments that we host on Amazon Mechanical Turk. These are amateurs that help us gather the data, and then from these specimens we can connect those data to, you know, climate information and look within season and across years how plants are responding. Our latest efforts are kind of tuned towards, you know, training automated models to basically, in some sense, remove the human from the operation of gathering the data to do it at an even larger scale. And so, yeah, the citizen science piece and component was that it started in one of our classrooms where I offered extra credit for Harvard undergrads to prototype our interface to score these specimens, and then we kind of you know, adapted it and then hosted it on a larger forum, and that's kind of how that developed.
Yeah.
And the actual scoring of the specimens, what that looks like is
Yes, I was
you're
going to ask you about that. Yeah.
looking at
Yeah.
a screen, and you, as the citizen scientist, count the number of reproductive structures. So you can count the number of like closed buds or open flowers, and then that tells you something about what phase that plant is in. And so what's happening with a lot of plants with climate change is that they're flowering earlier and earlier, so you would expect for the flower to bud ratio sort of to go up over time or in warmer years. And the work that Chuck is doing is actually allowing him to quantify that and how it varies across plant species, because it does vary, and how it varies over space as well. And so getting information at a scale that no one has been able to get, because we just don't have long-term data from anyone or many people at all on how flowering has changed over time, the timing of it.
So maybe you guys would like to expand a little bit about, you know, when a visitor enters the exhibit, you know, like what are you hoping that they come away with, or how they interact with it? Yeah, like what are you trying to achieve?
Well, it's a good question and a difficult one. I feel conflicted about it because on one hand, I don't ever want to tell people how they should feel about looking at a piece of art, and that is so subjective, and everyone comes with their own story and history, and that is a piece of why we look at art, right? Is to sort of have our own emotional sort of connection with it. So on some level, I hope it's open-ended. On the other hand, we are very specifically talking about specific issues. And so, you know, there's a lot of what you'll see if you haven't seen it, there's a lot of wall text and original specimens. So, you know, I think it's both. It's this sort of what is the actual science, and how are we having this kind of experience? I mean, for me, this color blue, you know, that I'm working with cyanotype, is a sort of meditative color, and I wanted to create a space that felt calm, and also this kind of sense of longing, and this sense of, I don't know, that Rebecca Solnit, who I read a lot, talks about the color blue and this kind of the blue of distance and this blue that we can never get to, and thinking about loss in that way, and coupled with the way that Robin is sort of animating these, and you know, this kind of balance of life and loss. So, I hope that there is some concrete information that gets, you know, gets into the conversation, and I think, you know, you see that on the video about the plant loss, like with actual numbers. And then what does it feel like to stand in a room that is surrounded by that loss, where you can see it, you know, with standing in front of the wallpaper, where you see all of those dark blues that are either gone or on their way out. So I think it's both. I mean, again, I don't want to prescribe a way to feel, but I do feel like we're trying to get the science across. And so hopefully there is, hopefully you walk away with some degree of kind of more informed. And also there's a local component to,
Right.
being here and it being Walden and Thoreau. So I think it hopefully resonates in a different way.
I would love to answer that in a slightly different way, which is one of our original ideas for the show was to have an actually interactive element. But just because of the time from when we started and when we needed to get it installed, we just decided to kind of put that to the side. But the whole idea was that people who were in the exhibition could interact with Robin's animations and learn more about some of the specimens and think more about the science behind it. So that was not there. Well, when I came for the opening, the next morning I came as soon as the museum opened, and it was just as a school bus had let off, and I was just alone in the exhibition with my cell phone, and I watched, probably in that hour, 60 kids come through the exhibition, and every single one of them thought it was interactive because they would jump in the pond and then they would touch the wall. They were like, oh, I did that. And so watching them, I realized, okay, we didn't even need to make this interactive.
Right.
And not only that, but just to see their joy of being in the space. And so obviously they were experiencing it on a different level. But just to kind of watch them light up at the thought of the way they had an impact on it, and I thought, okay, so some other iteration of this down the line, we can use this to kind of galvanize how can we communicate what that means in some way that would be succinct and meaningful that a 6-year-old might understand. So I think we have interesting challenges as we think about future iterations of the project too.
Isn't that beautiful? I think the reason why it's so beautiful, so I saw the exhibit for the first time yesterday, even though we've been working on it for 5 years, and there was this little girl with a little ponytail on the top of her head. She was probably 12 months old, and she was toddling through, and she would walk toward the wall where the projection was, and she would play with it, and then she'd stomp in the pond, and then she'd run back to her mom, and then she'd go back and do it again. And I think the reason why I think that's so beautiful is we're handing this warmer world to the next generation. And so the idea that kids could just interact with it in the moment and joyfully and playfully is really nice, because the world that they're going to inherit is not going to be as nice, and it's just nice to be able to hand them something joyful while their parents and all of us contemplate something that's a bit deeper. And yeah, underlying this entire exhibit the whole time has been something Leah touched on, which is that I feel terrible as a scientist, but it's true that when I open the New York Times and there's an article about climate change, I can't open it because I study climate change from 8 to 5 every day, and I just can't engage with it any more than that, and it's too sad and it's too challenging. And so the idea was, how do we bring beauty into the mix to sort of crack people open and make this problem seem like something they can talk about? And I don't even have a hope for people necessarily walking away with particular facts, but more that they walk away with, oh, that was really cool and visually beautiful, and hopefully I feel a bit cracked open and ready to talk about what I can do or what the people around me are doing.
No, and that totally makes sense. And I think we've all felt that way. It's you can't just read another article. And this gives it a totally new way of communicating the same message, but in a way that maybe doesn't feel quite as burdensome to interact with.
Yeah, it feels lighter.
Yeah.
We tinkered with so many different iterations of how to display this as the science was starting to come out, and it was fun, but it never quite had the impact on me that standing in front of that wall with the blue coming into relief, and it's just my God, it was really impactful. Yeah.
So yeah, this is actually we're sort of moving in this direction of what do you think sort of what are the kinds of changes you would like to see people make in their daily lives? How would you like to see this impact somebody, maybe a day or a week or a month? What do you want to see people sort of take away long term?
I guess I can answer that first. So some of the things that I want, I guess I just want people to talk about the things that they know they could do. And I know everyone here, and I myself am in constant conversation with myself about the benefit, drawback calculus of, do I eat this steak, or do I
Get on a plane.
yeah, get on a plane? Do I ride my bike? Do I go to this conference? And I am starting as a person to lean into my climate-friendly behaviors more. And that process is gradual. And I guess I hope that people walk away and are maybe able to lean into that and not expect themselves to change completely overnight, because it's unrealistic. But more for all of us to just do a little bit better. And as an entomologist, I really want people not to plant grass anymore.
We forgot to put that message in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that missed the Thoreau exhibit. That I hope.
No, but there
For me, I'm a plant nerd.
Yeah.
And it's all about, like, how do I get people to recognize the green world that's all around them and forms the matrix of life on Earth, and terrestrial life on Earth at least. And so, the combination of sharing this plant diversity, encouraging people to kind of recognize these distinctions, and themed around herbaria.
Yeah.
It's just
Oh,
like,
I know.
Like-
I know. You're like,
Exactly. And I think, you guys have just done such a wonderful job bringing this together in this amazing way.
well, and I love the native plant component too. That's something else I think people might take away from it, is more of awareness of our native plant diversity and ways that they might interact with that. But
I mean, this is again, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different than this, which is, I know some of you in the audience are students, and obviously you're interested in Thoreau or the environment or whatever brought you into this room. The way I felt working on this project, like, okay, I'm a film historian, what am I doing working on this project? Well, I would say get out of your lane. This is like the most important thing confronting us in every way. It is the existential crisis that we all have to engage with. And I think thinking about a way to, whatever your version of that is not feel like, oh, I can't do this, I can't speak to this, this is not my, I really think it's important that we all try to figure out the small things that we can do that might cumulatively make a difference if we all start trying to turn our attentions and energies to this. So for me, this was like stepping outside of my comfort zone with, like, okay, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an artist, but I'm not an artist also. So, but I hope other people, and work with people. People are awesome. Teams are awesome. Be interdisciplinary. Be be unafraid. Be creative. It's really rewarding to go out on a limb and try something and not know if it's going to go anywhere, and then all of a sudden it's there.
Yeah, I don't think I can say it too much. I mean, I do think, we need each other. And I think, the value of this kind of art-science collaboration is, as artists, we need the science. As science, you need the art. And so, I just think it's evident. It's evident in this exhibition. I also think that, I mentioned this before, just thinking about this kind of legacy that we're leaving. And it is, I think that idea of it is cracking open. I mean, I think about I have 9-year-olds, and they are like this thing that comes home every week, the shining penny, right? This new kid who gets to be the star for the week. And almost all of them, when they talk about what do you want to change or do in the world, it revolves around climate change. So I do think it is happening, it is shifting, and as we're walking through all these kids coming through, I don't know how many, there was a number at one point that was tens of thousands of kids come through. It's kind of astounding, and I just think if we can provide one little blip of information or experience to open that up a bit more, then I feel like we've done our job to a certain degree.
That's a nice note to end on. Shall we adjourn to the reception?
Sure.
So, thank you all very much.
Thank you for
Thanks for
coming.
having us. Thank you for coming.
guys are awesome, all of you.